What if we could use Bitcoin as a way to store energy from solar? Not like a lithium ion battery that you would find in a Tesla. What I mean is using excess solar power to actually do Bitcoin mining. That way, you can get the value of electricity even though you couldn't sell it or store it at that time, potentially unlocking gigawatts of solar across the globe. Because right now, we have significant number megawatts of solar across the US, even in states like Texas, that are waiting to come online because we can't use all of that electricity. Bitcoin mining might be the solution to that. And that's what Max Webster, a venture capitalist and investor at Version 1 VC, came on the show today to actually talk to us about his thesis as to why Bitcoin might be the key to unlocking megawatts or even gigawatts worth of solar through Bitcoin mining. You're not going to want to miss this. So, if you want to see more videos like this and you want to hear more contrarian ideas and explore the clean tech industry from a different perspective, from people actually in the space, hit the subscribe button below. It's entirely free. It seriously helps us out and it really is appreciated. So, with that being said, here's Max Webster.
Max, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're doing, and how you got involved with Bitcoin and solar?
Awesome. Yeah. So I come from the energy industry first and foremost. I've been interested in climate change and thought, this was like one of probably our generation's most important issues to solve for a very long time. Back in 2006, when I was in high school, I probably saw like an Inconvenient Truth or something around that time and thought, okay, this is, it seems like this is going to be a big politically hot issue as well. And perhaps there's something I can do kind of on the policy front to make a difference here. So when I went to college, the plan was to go to law school, become an environmental lawyer, to perhaps work with one of the environmental NGOs like NRDC and push for climate policy and regulation. However, when I was in college, I also was working on some of the first climate tort law cases, so basically suing oil companies on behalf of island states that are going underwater. I also went to like a bunch of the UNFCCC meetings. These are like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and just got really, I won't say completely disillusioned, but disappointed with both the sort of legal and political paths forward there. It just didn't seem to me like people really cared, to be honest. And particularly like, the kind of human rights angle that we were also hitting on, with the island states going underwater, seemed to be, honestly, just a more or less ignored fact. So around that time in 2012, when I was graduating from school, I decided not to go to law school. I was going to just initially take a year off and experiment with, sort of entrepreneurship or startup avenue instead. And my thinking was, well, look, if we can bring the cost of renewable energy like solar down to a point where it's cheaper than fossil fuels, then that's what's going to get the business community. That's what's going to force people to actually take action and solve this problem. And so out of college, I worked on a couple of different startups. The first one was crowdfunding for energy efficiency and solar projects. We did a couple projects there up in the Northeast in Connecticut. It was cool. We learned a lot. Quickly realized that we had no business, structuring billions of dollars of financial products, which is what that would have ultimately taken as 22-year-olds, and frankly didn't want to do that. But realized there was a lot of opportunity in the solar industry and realized that solar was going to absolutely explode. So through that, I ended up joining a company called Bright as the first hire there, part of the founding team. And basically, we're like Sunrun or Solar City for Mexico. And at the time, the guy that started the company, Jonah, when I met him, I remember asking, he's like, "Hey, do you know anything about Mexico?" I'm like, "Literally nothing." Do you speak any Spanish? I'm like, not a single word. He's like, "Great, you're a guy. Like, head down to Mexico and find us a bunch of customers." And what was interesting about that, though, and the analysis that he had just done is you could literally just, and you can still do this today, you can go like around the world and figure out one by one where countries are going to tip and where solar or wind or whatever is the sort of dominant resource in that country, but in most places it's solar, becomes cheaper than the conventional grid electricity. And Mexico had just tipped. And so that's why I went to Mexico. I was initially going to go for like 6 months, and that turned into basically 5 years. And I ended up living in Mexico, and had an incredible adventure with Bright. But through all that, just became increasingly convinced that that solar was going to be, probably the most important technological shift of our, or of the next couple of decades, just because energy is the input for everything. And you could watch the cost of solar literally just falling off a cliff. But another interesting sort of segue is while I was living in Mexico, I also got extremely interested in Bitcoin. And the reason I got interested in Bitcoin, I read about Bitcoin in 2011, thought the concept was cool, completely forgot about it, and obviously kicking myself now. In 2016, I actually got first into Ethereum because I was reading about I was interested in, like, with all of our energy customers, if there was a way that they could trade either tokenized kilowatt hours or renewable energy credits without like a utility middleman sitting in the middle of them. And so I looked at some of the cool projects that were working there. And while I was researching, I realized, wait a second, Bitcoin didn't die. And, I kind of had this intuition because I'd read about it in 2011 that, like, if it wasn't, killed by governments or, didn't gain adoption, if it didn't die in those, 5 or 6 years since I read about it, something was real there. And that just set off an obsession where, I tend to, when I get into a new technology, like I did with solar in the early days, I guess I can't help myself, but just like to read 24/7 and just go all the way down the rabbit hole. And it helped that I had a roommate at the time who was also very much like that, definitely a bit of an obsessive personality. And we went down the rabbit hole together. And then 2017 happened. When 2017 happened, I was like, oh yeah, this thing is for real. Even if this particular situation is a bubble, like this technology is not dying. So anyway, so that's what got me really excited and sort of obsessed with Bitcoin. And I should also mention, perhaps something else we'll talk about, the other light bulb moment for me that went off was that because I was living in Mexico, it was super easy to explain to my friends there the use case for Bitcoin and super difficult to my friends in the United States. And I would argue that Bitcoin basically has or has had some version of product market fit for a long time. It's just for the 6 billion people that don't happen to have access to the US dollar or euros, their native currency in the banking system that we enjoy. And so, all my friends' parents in Mexico, they had lived through at least 2 devaluations. My friends from Argentina or Venezuela that were living there were going through like hyperinflation as we spoke. So all of those concepts were kind of in the back of my head where it's like, okay, we live in an extremely privileged and unique position in the United States. And like, this was not, eventually it probably will be for everyone, but the first users are not going to be there.
That's actually fascinating.
I think crypto is cool, but it's definitely not a panacea. It's not going to solve all of our problems. I do think, and I'm sure we'll focus a lot of this conversation today, specifically Bitcoin is going to transform all of the energy markets because of mining. And I think that we're just getting started there.
So this is really interesting. And this is what I really want to talk about in this podcast, because you're one of the few people that I've seen online, other than folks like Jeff Booth, who understand the energy system, are a believer in climate change, want to solve it, yet are still a supporter of Bitcoin and feel that they actually can converge in a symbiotic way. So give us your thesis.
So I will caveat all of this by saying that I always keep an open mind, and I have some pretty strong views on all this today, but like things change quickly, and I'm certainly I'm not sort of like religious or doctrinal about this, even though I do think Bitcoin is a very good thing for humanity. But my thesis is sort of twofold. The first fold is that Bitcoin is flexible load. And so what that means is that I believe that Bitcoin is going to become the buyer of last resort for the cheapest electricity anywhere in the world. Okay. And so increasingly that's becoming renewable. I believe that Bitcoin is actually a key, at least in the short term, called the next decade, to unlocking what I'll call an abundant clean energy future. And what I mean by that is an energy future where it's almost entirely driven by solar and wind, and it's many multiples of our current electricity output for the grid. I think both of those things are good. I think having clean and solving climate change is critical, but I also think that in general, having more energy density for society, a ton more energy, like, is a good thing. And so I'm not one of these people, even though we talked about efficiency and I love efficiency and that's awesome. Like, at the end of the day, I think it's a lot more important that we figure out how to generate, a tremendous amount of energy that is clean, much cheaper. That's going to unlock all kinds of new markets, all kinds of new opportunities for people in emerging markets and around the world. And I don't know how sci-fi or cosmic you guys want to get, but we can talk about the whole sort of type 1, type 2 civilization status thing as well, if you're into that kind of thing, which I think Bitcoin is going to help us unlock. So let's take a step back and understand why. There's 3 things that you have to understand to kind of fully grasp my argument. The first thing is that the cost of solar and wind have literally fallen off of a cliff over the last decade, really since the 1970s with solar, and wind probably even earlier. But over the last decade, the cost curves have just been absolutely dramatic. So the cost of solar has come down, 80, 90%, wind 70, 75%, something like that. And so what that means is there's this concept of the levelized cost of electricity. And the levelized cost of electricity is all in, for all the money it costs to build your power plants and the fuel you have to keep supplying it, your CapEx and OpEx. What is the cost of a kilowatt hour, an individual unit of electricity to the end user? And for a long time, solar and wind were both very expensive. The reason they were even getting built at all was because of subsidies. And thanks to Germany for pushing a lot of that in their country with subsidies with solar, and China's done a lot recently as well. But the cool thing is, as individual countries put in place subsidies, the United States also on that list, it's driven down the cost of those energy sources for the entire globe, right? And so there's this concept called a learning curve or Wright's law. And you and your listeners are probably familiar with Moore's law. It's very similar. It's essentially a relative. And the idea is that for every doubling of cumulative capacity of some technology that you deploy, the cost of the end product of that technology falls generally by some more or less constant rate. And so in the case of solar in particular, that rate's been, depending on the source you look, anywhere between 20, 30, I've even seen, as high as 40%. So that means, let's be conservative and say 20%. For every doubling of the total amount of solar that we build in the world, the cost of electricity from that solar is 20% cheaper. And so we as human beings are not taught we're taught to see things linearly, but if you're able to kind of zoom out and look at things exponentially, what you'll see is the cost of solar just literally went like this, and wind a little bit less steep, but similarly. And so we're now in a case where the levelized cost of electricity from coal and natural gas, which is the dominant source for electricity systems throughout the world today, are somewhere between 5 and 7 cents per kilowatt hour. Solar is now, right here today as we're speaking, like 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. And wind is 2 to 5 cents, right? And obviously it all varies depending on if you're in a sunnier region or a windier region, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, and I cannot emphasize this enough for listeners, the cost of solar and wind is cheaper today than natural gas or coal. In fact, in many parts of the world, it is cheaper to build a new solar plant and operate it than it is to operate an existing coal plant, right? Because you have to keep feeding it coal. So there are cases where, and I've spoken with like some very big infrastructure funds that are buying coal plants to tear them down, use their grid interconnection, and build solar or wind resources there, right? So that is a huge thing that most people in the world don't notice. I would argue the two biggest, most important trends of the last decade were the cost of solar and wind collapsing exponentially, and the rise of Bitcoin exponentially. And I don't think those things are unrelated at all. In fact, I think they're one and the same. Okay, so that's number one. Second thing to understand, solar and wind are awesome and they're cheap, but they have one massive problem, and that's variability. Sun shines during the day, doesn't shine at night. Wind blows sometimes, doesn't blow other times. And that's true both daily and sort of seasonally. And so what you have is this intermittency challenge where you say, cool, we have this really cheap electricity. And in the case of solar, like here in California, in the middle of the day, the sun shines a lot and we have all this electricity. Awesome. The problem is when people, back in the old days, you guys may recall a time when people went to work and came home. That no longer is the case, but in 2019, people would come home around 5, 6, 7 p.m. and that's when they would turn on their washing machines and whatever other appliances. And so you have this high demand for electricity in the evening when there is no sun, and this glut of overproduction of capacity in the afternoon when there is a lot of sun. And this is what's been famously called in California the duck curve, right? And because it looks like a duck, there's a big fat belly of overproduction during the day. And we can link to an article that shows this people, but a head of demand that rises during the night. And so the problem there is, and this curve basically exists throughout the world, is that you have this really cheap electricity source, but it's not well matched. The supply and demand are not temporarily, time-wise, well matched. Okay, so that means that you have this limit on how much solar and wind that you can deploy in the world today. Now, what's crazy and what most people don't realize is there is demand and finance and capital ready to build a ton more solar and wind than is currently built. If you want to build a new utility scale solar or wind project, you basically have to get, it's all kinds of approval processes, but you have to get the grid, and there's many grids throughout the United States, but you have to get the grid operator to basically approve your project. And for them to approve your project, they have to be able to balance all of the power that you're going to put onto the grid. And so if you're in a grid where you've already kind of saturated you've already got a ton of solar or a ton of wind, even if the cost, the next marginal unit of solar wind that you deploy is going to be a lot cheaper, it doesn't matter because you can't use that energy on the grid, right? And so what we have now is in ERCOT, in Texas's electricity market alone, you have over 100 gigawatts of solar and wind that are delayed. The projects are there, the financing is either ready or will be easily available. But they can't get built because the grids literally can't deal with their excess electricity. Same is true all throughout the world. California, I forget the exact number, but it's like 60, 70 gigawatts. PJM, which is the mid-Atlantic states, another 50, 60 gigawatts, whatever. So in just those three grids alone, you got about 200 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity that is ready to rock and roll, and they can't deploy it because of congestion and the intermittency, right? So how do you solve that problem? Well, the most obvious way to solve that problem is with batteries. And I'm also a huge proponent of batteries. Lithium ion batteries have also come down a similar cost curve to solar, slightly less steep, but let's call it another 20% learning rate. So I don't have the most recent numbers on batteries off the top of my head, but we're getting close to a point where in many geographies, it makes sense. In fact, in California, it almost always already makes sense to build your solar with a battery. That's going to continue to grow as a trend, but there's still some limitations to batteries, right? Like there's, shortages of lithium ion. There's still physical limits to how long you can store electricity for. So as a rough rule of thumb, let's say you can store it for 48 hours, but not beyond that. So like batteries will play a super critical role in the grid. And there's going to be other technologies, right? Like that are much cheaper. Like if you're next to a dam, you can like pump water uphill and then store energy that way. But there's still a lot of limitations. So batteries are critical. They're going to play a huge role, but they're not a panacea. They don't solve everything. Okay. Number 3, Bitcoin. How does Bitcoin solve this problem? Well, Bitcoin is the ultimate flexible load. And what do I mean by that? Bitcoin, unlike almost any other in-power, user in the world, what Bitcoin miners do is they essentially do a Sudoku puzzle. It's a cryptographic hash function called SHA-256, but it's like literally like one operation. And so because of that, each operation is unique, which means if I shut down my Bitcoin miners, I don't lose the past work, right? It's not like, oh, I was in the middle of doing all this complex protein folding and then shit, my power went out and now I lost all that work. No, you can just like basically more or less turn on and off at will. And so what that means is that you have this perfectly dynamic load, which can basically say, hey, anytime you have a whole bunch of excess solar or wind electricity on the grid, cool, we can fire up the Bitcoin miners and mine Bitcoin with that. Similarly, on the demand side, because it's flexible, you can also enter into what's called like demand response programs or your grid, where they say, hey, we typically have these Bitcoin miners running, which is awesome. Right now, we need that extra electricity for something else. Like, I don't know, right now in Texas, where there is no power, we're going to have to pay you to turn off because we need that for the grid. So the point is, it's perfectly dynamic, perfectly flexible load. What's crazy is, and what almost no one realizes, is that you could build, probably most or some meaningful percentage of that 200 gigawatts of solar and wind that's currently blocked right now if you connected Bitcoin miners with them. Okay. So there's a lot of complications that we can get into, like, how long ASICs last and profitability calculations, et cetera, et cetera. But the general point is solar and wind are very cheap. They can't be deployed because of congestion in the duck curve. Bitcoin allows them to be deployed today.
So really what it is because I think even from just a utility or retail electric perspective, rather than basically sinking and grounding the entire excess that they're producing, because there's already existing facilities that are just sinking power, especially at the large scale. And you have a lot of new software companies popping up. I know one Israeli startup, I met his founder once at a conference, and they're trying to model out, based on already existing demand, how big a solar farm should be. So rather than just saying, let's build as much capacity to replace, it's just a matter of how can we reduce the amount of power coming from these non-variable, or these variable sources of power. Well, okay, so I guess what you're saying is, as solar capacity increases, the duck curve will remain. Rather than sinking and not using that electricity for any useful production, instead, let's go ahead and use that to mine more Bitcoin, which can also provide, because it's being used as a store of value, it's providing some kind of capital return for that electricity in that financial model for that solar farm, as opposed to saying, if we build 100 megawatts of solar capacity here, we're only going to get the advantage of 20 of that. But now you can say the full capacity can be used.
Yeah, that's more or less right. And I think there's two things that are important to highlight. One is exactly as you're saying. Without Bitcoin miners, projects are impossible or not financially feasible. With Bitcoin mining, they're both possible and financially feasible. The second thing that's kind of, and this is where I get a little bit crazier and more sort of sci-fi in my views is, I believe there's demand just with like our conventional, our conventional load today. If you look at growing urban centers, there's more population, more people are moving into the middle class in a lot of cities around the world, which means they're going to want, the same appliances that we take for granted. Like electric load is increasing massively. Same with EVs. Like everything is electrifying. So I personally have no doubt there's going to be more than enough use cases for this electricity. But what's crazy and what really, really excites me, and this is one of the things that even some very sophisticated critics, in my opinion, don't fully grasp, is the learning curve is not done, right? Like I think one trap that humanity often falls into is we think, oh, evolution, yeah, that was the thing that happened, and now it brought us here. It's like, well, here is just right in the middle of the evolutionary process. Like this is not a special time. Like no time is uniquely special, right? We're in the middle of evolution, and so there will come a time when that S curve will flatten off. But from everything I've seen, there's nothing to suggest we're anywhere near that for wind or especially solar. And so I believe it's extremely possible that, by quote over deploying, and it's not even really over deploying because there is use case for that electricity today, but for overbuilding what conventionally makes sense to grid operators today, not only are we bringing that electricity online, but here's the beautiful thing: we're driving down the cost of that solar and wind for everyone else for generations to come. And so what that means is, call solar 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour today, you'd get 3, 4 more doublings of that. All of a sudden, could you get 1 or sub 1 cent cost per kilowatt hour? Absolutely. And what does that do? Well, that unlocks new markets and new opportunities that humanity can only dream of. Desalination of water, carbon removal, right? You can literally power machines to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, creation of green hydrogen. All of these markets that are infeasible at current cost become feasible once the marginal cost of electricity approaches zero. And that's where I think we're headed.
So you're saying that Bitcoin essentially will, in a way, accelerate the expansion of renewables, which will get us to a world that is closer to zero cost of energy, or virtually
Correct.
zero.
Correct.
It makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. The main issue with renewables is it's like, why is gas so great? Why is nuclear so great? We can control it to a T as to when it's, going on and off. The problem with renewables is we can't do that. So this is a key, right? It's like the ultimate. It's like the ultimate load source that's actually incredibly lucrative, at least right now, right? So this all works out as long as it is a profitable investment. Do you see it continuously being profitable?
So I want to say two things on this. One, I want to be very clear for your listeners. Bitcoin is awesome, but again, it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve all of our problems. I actually think this is inevitable with or without Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin accelerates it, which I think is a great thing for humanity. Batteries are still absolutely critical. Like we cannot have this world without, lithium-ion batteries continue to come down their cost curve and new storage technologies. And so in the long run, and by the way, any entrepreneurs out there, a company that I really would love to fund is something that is looking at in real time for any electron. What do I do with it? Do I use it? Do I store it? Or do I mine it? Like, I think you're basically going to have like a hierarchy of profitable use cases for electricity, and storage is 100% part of it. We cannot solve it without storage. Huge storage fan, but I think storage and mining are complementary. So that's one thing. Second thing, your question. Yes, this all assumes that Bitcoin doesn't collapse and the price either stabilizes or continue to go up. And that's why I think this is still pretty out there for a lot of people. I think in order to really grasp all of these arguments and buy into them, if you are a utility or a sustainable infrastructure to make these investments, you have to see and believe in both S curves. The S curve of declining energy prices and the S curve of Bitcoin becoming, a new global reserve currency or store value. I can't predict the future, and that is a risk, but I feel increasingly confident by the day that that's where Bitcoin is headed. This is my personal opinion. I think Bitcoin is already won. I think it's already a global reserve currency. I think it's just going to take time, like, for everyone to realize that. And the reason is the things that really matter for a global reserve currency are you need finality in who owns what, essentially. You need liquidity and you need security, right? And so Bitcoin has dominant advantages and network effects around security, which is the mining and the energy that's going into securing this blockchain. Liquidity, you can get in and out of Bitcoin anywhere in the world almost instantly. And I think that's really all that matters. Now, there's a lot of other cool projects. We invest in a lot of Ethereum-based projects. That's awesome. I ultimately, though, see a world where there's probably, my guess, one blockchain that converts electricity to digital scarcity, and then a lot of other blockchains that somehow tie into that blockchain and sort of leverage that one conversion, right? So, I'm not a full Bitcoin maximalist. I'm like, oh, everything's Bitcoin, but I do think everything eventually will tie somehow into Bitcoin, because that conversion of physical to digital scarcity, I think it just makes sense from a God's eye view. It should only be done once, and whatever is the most efficient way to do that will probably win. And I think there's also all kinds of interesting scaling stuff happening with Lightning Network, et cetera, we can talk about on Bitcoin. But the other thing, though, is it's a risk, right? Like, you can't predict the future, right? So that's why Bitcoin is not $1 million a coin right now. You're going to pay for that risk.
This is interesting. So in 2017, I was working at PG&E, the utility, and I was working with their battery development team. So I was actually interning there at the time, and I was working on their first battery project.
That's awesome. Yeah.
It was interesting, but it's interesting how Bitcoin at that time, Bitcoin was doing it. It was popping off 2017, and at that time, for them, it was risky to even look at batteries, and that was my kind of role to look at who to recommend. So if I would have said, hey, we should look at Bitcoin mining, they would have been like, get the fuck out of here. Literally. So your internship is done.
Yeah, exactly.
So, ultimately, I know Ross Stevens and Michael Saylor, the biggest Bitcoin maximalists of the year, I think, talked about this idea of utilities being the future of, Bitcoin mining. So I'm really excited for that to happen. I wish I was behind the scenes hearing if they're even talking about it at this point. So I'm curious on your thoughts there. Do you agree? Do you subscribe to that idea of utilities actually owning mining systems?
Whether or not they'll mine initially or partner with someone else, I'm not sure what's going to be most common in terms of who owns the physical asset, right? So you could have the utility own it. You could have some infrastructure fund or a company like a Tesla or whoever's doing these projects. They could raise their own funds to own it. So I'm not sure exactly how all the specifics will play out, but I can assure you utilities and infrastructure funds are looking at this right now.
Yeah, it makes total sense. It's so obvious, especially as the price keeps going up and up. And I know these mining companies are having absurd margins right now, inconceivably high margins. And you have to turn your head when you see that.
Well, and I want to be clear, right? And we can go into the philosophy of how genius it was for Satoshi to program in the halvenings and the 4-year hype cycles. And its hype cycles is a go-to-market strategy, which is genius. This will not last. The margins you're seeing in mining right now are insane. It's not sustainable. That's how you bootstrap a network, however. So I think it's much more interesting, again, whenever I think about Bitcoin and people ask me, oh, but it's too volatile, blah, blah. In order for this whole vision to play out, it does have to more or less stabilize in price. It will never fully stabilize, as Jeff Booth explains. It's deflationary currency, but maybe that deflation level ends up being something like 2% a year or something, right? Something small. And so it's still the Wild West. Cowboys can still get in there and do really well right now. Eventually, it has to smooth out, and this has to become a very boring asset.
Right, and that's just stability, right?
So when you look at, because I'm really fascinated by this concept of load shaping, especially when it comes to Bitcoin mining, because you also see quite a number of people say well, what's the carbon footprint of Bitcoin mining, and isn't that a bad use of energy because of how people are going about that? How have you typically thought about that question? If we switch Bitcoin mining towards just using renewable sources of power, the entire carbon footprint question just kind of walks out the right door. And it sets us up for a really interesting position where the financials of solar suddenly change on a dime, because now you're not too worried about feeding in based on wholesale market rates. And you're not playing in a dynamic market. You're just looking for the best return for the energy that you have.
Yeah. So, I let me preface this. I'm not an expert on that. And probably if you follow Nick Carter at all, he's right. He's written a lot about this. He's probably got the most interesting take, although I think it's impossible for anyone to fully say, right? These are very hard things to quantify. My take on it is this: I don't know what the carbon intensity of Bitcoin is. I have no idea what the actual numbers are on renewable hash rate. I've read everything from 40% renewables to 70% renewables. Let's say it's a third. Let's go super conservative. it's we know hydro is a big piece of it in China, and hydro I'm not a huge fan of because of other environmental externalities, but it is at least in theory carbon neutral. Um, but my take on it is just like, honestly, I don't really care that much about the debates today because I think they're pretty myopic and like focus on the short term. Like I'm much more interested in the bigger term question. If what I think if what I think is going to happen happens, which is that Bitcoin becomes, the sort of de facto flexible load with solar and wind being installed, it's an irrelevant question, right? We're at 10 to 20 gigawatts of mining capacity around the world today. As we start deploying a whole lot more solar and wind, there's 200 gigawatts of delayed interconnected projects in the United States alone. You could literally dwarf the entire mining, like the mining industry today, it's irrelevant compared to what the mining industry in 10 years is going to look like. And it's going to be almost entirely renewable. And what's beautiful is as you keep deploying more and more, as we talked about, solar and wind keeps coming further and further and further and further down the cost curve, which means one day solar and wind will be even cheaper than hydro. Right. Even in the cheapest sources. And so, look, it's not, and I also want to be clear, like, it's not an entirely black and white issue either, right? Like, right. Bitcoin does, like, there is coal, there is, dirty sources of energy that is mining this. There's also the geopolitical questions, which is a whole different podcast. And so I'm not going to sit up here and say like, oh, it's only a good thing. Like, I think it's on balance a good thing, but like, yeah, of course there's negative carbon impact. Of course, it uses a lot of energy. The next question though becomes, even if you don't buy everything I'm saying, who gets to determine what's a good use of energy? Who makes that decision?
That's true,
right? Like who is the power broker that's like, oh, we decide this is good and this is bad. And I think that's what a lot of society is kind of waking up to right now. Is it's like, 12 dudes in a room that get to decide monetary policy and decide for the rest of the world what's right and what's wrong. Like, nah, I'm not a fan of that. So I'm not saying that regulation doesn't have a role, and it certainly does. But I think it's a very slippery slope once you start trying to decide like, oh, this system is all good and this system is all bad. Like, again, I'm not an expert on this, but if you read some of Nick's pieces, he's quite good where he's like, hey, like, why is the US dollar like only accepted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia? Do some research on that whole history, right? Is that a good or a bad thing? Well, it depends on who you ask. People in the Middle East probably not a big fan, right? So, that's
that makes
a controversial question.
It makes a lot of sense because like I see where you're going with it, and having been in the space, it makes a lot of sense, especially from a Bitcoin mining perspective. We just look at it in that microcosm of you're building solar farms to get more renewable power up and online. I mean, the amount of grid infrastructure upgrades required to even plug a 100 megawatt solar farm in is so ridiculous that utilities just don't have the tech to keep up. I mean, you look at batteries and their adoption rate by utilities from an infrastructure front, they don't even know how to manage it yet. And to be fair, their whole premise is to try and build resilient infrastructure, and batteries plus Bitcoin mining could make the best kind of hybrid financial decision for them if a startup does pop up that can handle that kind of load shedding. It just sounds like it would be game changing for the industry.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying this is the only answer either. Like, I've heard some people say like, oh, we should be focusing on more interconnection, high voltage, capacity lines or whatever. Like, cool, I'm a fan of all of that. The biggest thing that I would like to get across, and perhaps my most kind of like out there idea, is like, the answer is all of the above, right? Like, we as society need to get out of this trap of like, this is how much energy we have. No, we can have orders of magnitude more.
It's super complicated, and unfortunately, I think few people understand the energy side from the generation standpoint to the regulation standpoint, because it's such a mess. It seems kind of archaic, right? And we're seeing the folly of it right now with Texas having their whole ordeal. It's obviously there needs to be some major changes in the financial system and the energy system. And Max, you're thinking, hey, let's marry them. Let's do it together.
Totally, yeah. And I got to give a shout out. There are a couple of startups that are looking at this. Toshi Energy's got a great thing they're working on. Terra Verde Energy has been in the solar industry a long time. They're doing a new spin out that's looking at this. So that there are people that are looking at this. But if you're an entrepreneur or entrepreneurs that are also working on this, hit me up. We're very excited. One of the big questions that I do have, though, as much as I love these teams and these projects, is just, is this a venture scale opportunity? Is this more of a kind of like project finance sort of boutique thing? And we're still kind of making up our mind there. But Yeah, it's
I
gonna
mean,
happen.
do you not see it as something venture scale? Because I see it as like almost like what AutoGrid and all are doing. No, wouldn't it just be grid management software?
I in general, I guess I'm a little biased. Like I think selling to utilities, particularly regulated utilities, is like a long slog.
Yeah,
The company, I mean, like O-Power kind of did it, sort of. But if you know, and again, this is where you have to kind of like, if I think with a VC hat on versus think as like just an interested sort of investor hat on, there's all kinds of interesting investment opportunities for a VC scale opportunity though. There needs to be, there's some like network effect that you can build in here and you build like a huge marketplace that you can take a cut of, or you have, you're like kind of like a SaaS play, but it's not SaaS because you're taking like a fee on like percentage of capital deployed. You have so much capital that you're deploying into these projects and you have a cut of that like, perhaps you can get to, 100 to a billion in ARR one day or something like that. But even then I question perhaps the better play is just raising your own fund, which I think is interesting, right? So like you both have a startup and then you raise a multi-billion-dollar sustainable infrastructure fund. Like these are all various plays, and they're really smart people that are thinking about them. And yeah, I'm trying to keep an open mind. So would love to be convinced. And yeah, if your
yeah. No,
listeners are out there doing it, tell
it's
me.
just it's interesting because like what I've been seeing is, and like you say with the slog that it is to just get anything interconnected. I mean, you're seeing projects sub 5 megawatts and sub 20 megawatts start to become more popular. Just again, cost has tanked so far that those projects make economic sense. I'm saying those deals, especially in states like Wisconsin and the Midwest, where wind is probably a better source of power to pull from than solar, where solar doesn't really make as much financial sense. Bitcoin mining actually clicks really well in those environments because not only is the weather far better for a mining kind of operation or data centers in general, but now you have an opportunity to get projects rapidly interconnected if they're sub 5 megawatts. And if you can do some level of aggregation, then if a company came out with software for that, for smaller size solar farms interconnected and paired with Bitcoin mining and maybe a little bit of battery for distributed energy focuses, it just sounds like something that's licensable at scale because of the rate at which not even startups, but just infrastructure companies are building solar farms. It almost sounds too easy and too true if someone can build the tech, albeit. But it's. I want to hear your
I can
ideas
see the light
on
bulb
the
is going
more.
off. Perhaps it'll be you guys.
Sure, if maybe we're that smart, right? Is there anything else that you would like to speak about, mention, clarify? Otherwise, we'll give you 12 minutes to prepare for your next call.
Yeah, hey man, VC is awesome, but it's a lot of calls. So.
I can imagine.
especially post COVID, right? But yeah, I mean, I'll say first of all, I think it's awesome. Like, how old are you guys? Oh, like 24, 25 or something?
I'm 24.
I'm 23. Yeah.
I think it's awesome to see the next generation. Like, I mean, I'm not that old, I'm 30, but like seeing the next generation when I was your age. No, but seeing the next generation of people so excited about energy and climate, it's got me like super, super stoked because when I was getting into this, it was still, there was some excitement, but it was still kind of like, oh, but like the real opportunities, the real scalability, the real money is in, building Facebook and that sort of thing. Yeah. So anyways, I just think it's awesome you guys are doing this. And I hope more young people decide to dedicate the next 10 years of their career to this. I think it's great. Similarly on the Bitcoin side, I think if I were telling some kid today, like what they should be working on, crypto outside of climate, I love climate, but like, man, it's the next internet. And I feel very lucky to have been born at a time when I'm still young enough to play there.
So I guess with that, if anyone wants to continue the conversation with you, what's the best way to reach you? What's your
Twitter.
preferred way to be reached? Twitter.
Yeah, hopefully one day we'll have a decentralized Twitter, but it's at Max A Webster. Max A
Sweet.
Webster.